So homelessness, it's bad. It's getting worse. I came across a statistic from HUD that in 2023, there in a single night, there were 650,000 people in the United States that were homeless. And that was up 12% from the year before. So bad, getting worse. This is not just a COVID thing. This is something that is continuing to get worse. And what's interesting is that was a 12% increase, even though poverty had not increased by that much. The lack of affordability of housing, which we talk a lot about on this podcast, is having an impact, certainly at the lowest end and those that are most desperate. But it's not just the United States. Affordability and the lack of housing is an issue across the globe. Every major city has an issue with it that they're trying to figure out how to work through. And since it's a global issue, it seems to me that perhaps we should be talking about this from a global perspective.
You are listening to the Afire podcast, real estate, technology, cross-border investing, and the opportunities of a changing world. Let's start a conversation now.
And based on someone that I recently met, it may be actually the answer, or where some of the answers can be found, not just in thinking about it as an American problem, but thinking about it as a global problem. And I'm talking about Lydia Stazen, who's the executive director of the Institute of Global Homelessness. They started back in 2014, and they are really the first organization to look at homelessness as a global issue and to try to bring together some of the best thinking, some of the best activity from around the world to apply it to this problem. So thank you so much, Lydia, for joining me on the Afire podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation and explore a lot of the different intersections and nuances that we see in homelessness, both here in the United States and around the world.
So from your global perch of looking at the homeless problem, tell me, what's the answer? How do we solve this? How do we get ourselves out of this jam?
Yeah, well, one of the things, obviously, that we've learned from our work globally, and IGH does work across 6 continents on the issue of homelessness, is that unfortunately there's no silver bullet. There is no one particular answer that is going to end homelessness the same way in every single community and every single culture. But we have found that there are certain pillars that each community needs to think about and each community needs to explore and have dedicated strategies around. So just at a high level, some of the things that we look at are what is your community's definition of homelessness? So you kicked off talking about 650,000 people in the United States who are experiencing homelessness. That number is driven by HUD's definition of what homelessness is. And for HUD, it's people living on streets or in places not intended for human habitation, like a car or underneath a bridge or in a tent, and also sheltered homelessness. And other communities will expand that definition to include people who are living in inadequate or insecure housing, who are living in doubled up or overcrowded situations. So the first thing that we start with is, what is your community or your country's definition of homelessness? Because you cannot solve a problem if you're not clear on what problem it is you're trying to solve. And then the second pillar that we look at is the data. Okay, now that you have your definition of homelessness, how many people are experiencing that type or that form of homelessness? And once you have your definition and your data in place, you can really start to put meaningful strategies in place to serve those people.
So it sounds a little wonky, but to a certain extent, the first thing we have to do is be able to see it exactly for what it is, to understand it precisely, because you're right. There's a lot of emotional kind of definitions, if you will, around it, and it can get kind of squishy, I would think, in terms of understanding what the problem is.
Yes, absolutely. And the language that we use around homelessness is really, really important. But understanding that homelessness is a systems failure. It's you don't often suddenly wake up and find yourself homeless overnight. There's been a series of things that have happened in an individual's life. And a lot of those things have to do with the systems and structures of a particular community. How easy is it to ask for help when you need it? Is there enough help that you can access, enough to go around for all the people who need it? So being thoughtful about the definitions, being thoughtful about the language, but still It kind of comes back to those old management maxims of like what gets measured gets done. And you
Right.
can't measure if you don't have some kind of definition of what the problem is.
A couple of our guests, I think it's interesting that you've said that you referred to it as being a systems failure, because a couple of our guests have talked about affordable housing and an abundance of affordable housing, enough for everyone, as being an infrastructure issue at the same level as safe drinking water, at the same level as appropriate energy, as appropriate education, all these kinds of elements that you need to have in place in order to have a successful society. And to your point, if it's a systems failure, that means the entire system is lacking something that it needs in order to be successful. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And so once we've worked with communities sort of on their definition of homelessness and their data collection on homelessness, then you can start to put in the solutions that actually work. And then you can evaluate based on the numbers whether your strategies are being effective. And you can boil down the solutions to housing and services. And so wherever you are in the world, the solution to homelessness is going to be a mix of housing and services.
So that's the answer: housing and services.
That's the answer.
But how does that work? It's difficult. You're dealing with people, you're dealing with different societies, you're dealing with all these various issues. It's messy, I would think. So, but you're working with, 13 cities around the world with your Vanguard program, and they're all finding different solutions. So what are they finding? What is it that helps them get housing and services in place for their system?
So the other kind of pillars that we explore are, one, is the community working in collaboration? There's no one nonprofit agency that can solve homelessness alone. Government can't solve homelessness alone. Business can't solve homelessness alone. If you think about homelessness at its core, it's a breakdown of community. It's a lack of community. And so coming up with solutions to homelessness is going to require a whole of community response, a whole of society response. And so we really believe that we need to be setting very inclusive stakeholder tables in these communities where we work, to make sure that government is at the table, that the nonprofit sector is at the table, that people who have experienced homelessness are at the table, because theirs is a perspective that is often not heard and not listened to in coming up with these solutions. We look for business to be at the table. We look for real estate investors and affordable housing developers to be at the table. The communities need to be working in collaboration on this issue and creating city or community-wide strategies for how to deal with it. And then we'll work with the service providers on what is their outreach. How are you engaging people who live on the street? A lot of times people have been living on the street for a very, very long period of time. That happens a lot in the United States. In other communities, like our colleagues in Sao Paulo, Brazil, since the pandemic, they've noticed an increase of family homelessness. Prior to the pandemic, they did not have mothers with children living on the street, but they had a 150% increase in family homelessness since the pandemic. And so they have really focused on moving those families, those mothers with young children, off of the street, giving them some supports. But how are you engaging with the people who are on the street? Do you know their stories? Do you know what types of housing they're going to need? Do you know what types of services they're going to need? And so bringing a really person-centered approach to the outreach, and then making sure that across your city, the solutions that those individual people and families need are at their fingertips, so that there are housing units for people to move into. There are different services that they can access, whether that's employment, education, physical and mental health resources, those types of things. So it's a complicated thing to make sure you have the right mix in place and the right data and the right relationships with people who are experiencing homelessness in order to slot all of that together. And so I think that's why it's such a sticky problem that we see communities struggling to deal with. But once a community has those pieces into place, you can really make substantial progress on homelessness.
It is interesting to me because it's become much more visible. It's become much more of a political issue. Suddenly politicians are having to address it in some way. But to your point, there's no silver bullet. And yet, a lot of times the response to homelessness seems to me to be, let's find that silver bullet. Let's just clear them out.
Yeah.
Let's just move them along. And you have people that I think well-intentioned will say things like, well, the problem is that they don't want to move into a home. That the people that are homeless are there because of their own perhaps instability, perhaps because of whatever problems they might have, perhaps because they would prefer that to living in a home or having a steady job, and therefore they're there. How do you help these communities, whether it's the government or it's the people in the community, understand the need to move beyond perhaps some of these easy gut responses that people have to the problem?
What we have learned through our work and what the research and evidence base shows, and what our colleagues who have the lived experience of homelessness have worked with us on, is every person will come off the street when the offer is right and when the relationship is right. And so we need to be taking the onus on ourselves and our communities to up our offer. And so if you are on the street and the only offer is for you to split up from your partner, to leave your pet behind and come into a congregate shelter where you can't wear your hat, where you have to be in bed by 8 p.m., where you have to abide by these series of rules, it really can, it becomes like, I wouldn't take that choice. If I was living on the street with my dog and had to leave my partner behind, and I've lost everything else in the world to go into a shelter where I might get bed bugs, like, that's not a compelling offer. And so when we've worked with communities on a compelling offer, we again have seen incredible success. And I think the pandemic taught us a really strong lesson in that regard, where we saw communities, and this was a great, I think, innovation between business, government, and NGO during the pandemic, when hotel rooms were empty and the hotel industry was hugely struggling. And so government and NGOs, we saw this happen all across the world. And we didn't know anything about the virus at that point either. And so it was like, okay, we got people off the street. Like, London was down to 0 people on the street. London in England, Glasgow, Scotland was down to 0 people on the street. They were putting them into hotels, but also providing case management support to those people in those hotels. And it was for a short amount of time, but everyone came in off the street. Everyone came in off the street because they got their own room, they got a bathroom, and they had services, right? And so I think I would love to see our communities around the world really step up and think through, what's the compelling offer to bring people in off the street? And do we have that offer available to them? And is it timely? Can we make this offer quickly? Because the longer people stay in a form of homelessness, the more trauma they're experiencing, the more their trust in institutions that are meant to help them is breaking down. And so it makes it even more challenging to engage people in housing and services the longer that they've lived on the street. But we know without a doubt that when the offer is right and the relationships are right, everyone will come in off the street.
Make a compelling offer. I think that's a profound idea. And when you think about it, it's not just in terms of homelessness. I think it's in terms of living generally. And if you are providing communities and homes that fulfill the needs that human beings have, you're going to have a better outcome. I think there's a tendency for us to think about needing to warehouse people versus providing a home, a community. And a community is where those services can come from and be self-sustaining, where it's not simply we have to move heaven and earth from a government perspective, a non-governmental organization perspective, in order to provide basic services. If it's a functioning community, if it's a neighborhood, if people are able to do for their neighbors and for each other and themselves, they're going to need less outside help. And that, I think, is something that has been missed a lot about that. When you think about homelessness, and we've talked a little bit about this already, what is it that people don't understand, that they need to understand? They don't understand that it's not warehousing, that it needs to be a compelling offer. But what else do you think, as a population, we need to understand better about the homeless problem?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways that I can answer that question. I think one thing people need to understand, that homelessness is a choice. It's not the individual's choice. These are systemic policy choices that have been created at certain points by certain governments and certain leaders. And that if we really look at the evidence about what kinds of policy choices, what types of housing infrastructure choices, what types of choices our societies are making, we can really end homelessness. And that everyone has a role to play in ending homelessness. I think that extends to the business community, to the real estate community. We all benefit when our communities have low instances of homelessness and low instances of housing insecurity. It's better for all of us. And so just thinking through, what are some of those choices where we could make a different choice, and really build communities where people have access to affordable housing, where they have access to emergency financial assistance when it's needed. Because what the sort of global sector is moving towards is, how do we prevent this from happening? Because it is really expensive to resolve homelessness once someone falls into it. What can we be doing further upstream in order to, keep this from happening, to keep people stable in their homes and surrounded by the supports that can keep them stable? So, when we think about homelessness prevention, we're looking at the number of hospitals that discharge people into homelessness. We think about, and that's true globally. Another driver that's true globally is the carceral system. People are going into jails and prisons and serving their time, which should be their repayment to society for whatever crime they've committed. But then when they come out of prison, they don't have access to any kind of housing or support. And so that also contributes to a recidivism rate, so just thinking through those components, like once people have sort of paid their debt to society, how are we reintegrating them in ways that keep them stable and in a positive space? And another huge factor is here in the United States and in a couple other places around the world, but largely in the United States, is veteran homelessness. And so how are we supporting our veterans who have served our country and making sure that when they are discharged from service, that they have the support that they need? I remember talking to a young vet, this was several years ago. He was I think he was 26 or 27 at the time, and he had experienced homelessness after leaving the service. And he said to me, I joined the military at 18, and for the last 10 years of my life, I was told where to wake up, when to fall asleep, when to use the restroom. Like, everything was taken care of for me. And then I got 3 days of discharge planning, and it did not include how to find an apartment and what it meant to sign a lease. So we need to be thinking about those kind of transition points in people's lives. Another one that's kind of similar is kids who have grown up in the foster care system. And when they turn 18, there's a huge gap there. And so we see many of our young people, both here in the United States and in other places around the world. This is a really common theme, that when, kids have been in care situations and they reach, the sort of arbitrary level of adulthood, they're not supported into housing. And so there's so many things that we need to be thinking through upstream. In the United States, the number one predictor of if you will be homeless as an adult is if you were homeless as a child. And so we really need to be working upstream to make sure that children and families are not experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness, because that's going to have ripple effects for the rest of that child's life.
And it certainly puts to rest the idea that people are homeless because they want to be homeless.
Yeah.
I think that it seems that we need to get that out of our heads,
Exactly.
that idea.
Yeah.
It certainly doesn't help us solve the problem if we're thinking along those lines. What is it that you think, and you work a lot with cities, and you have your Vanguard cities that are trying to solve for this problem. What do you think? And you say it's a choice, and it's a policy choice quite often. What is it that they're doing that doesn't work, that they think might help, that it doesn't help solve the problem and may even make it worse?
Yeah, there's a series of things that we see across communities that are not all that useful in ending homelessness. One, which actually ties to a recent Supreme Court case here, is the idea of criminalizing people who are living on the street. So is it illegal to sleep on the street? Is it illegal to sleep on a park bench? And we see around the world, we're seeing a move towards that type of criminalization. So if you are sleeping on the street or in a public place, the police can pick you up, put you in jail or prison. And that's not effective because it doesn't resolve what that person actually needs, which is housing and services. And so it becomes this cycle of just revolving door, like moving into a prison or jail, being discharged without any housing and services. So you wind up sleeping on the street again. So it just isn't effective. We could argue a lot about sort of philosophical and moral perspectives on that, but what we look at IGH is like what is actually effective, and we find that criminalization is not effective. Another thing that we see across communities is a lot of like temporary and transitional programming where you live 3 months in the shelter, then you live 2 years in this housing program, then you live 2 years in that housing program. And every time there's a step like that, there's a decent number of people who return to homelessness. And so we really need to move more towards, okay, you're experiencing homelessness. How do we move you into your permanent home, whatever that looks like for you? It doesn't mean that you're going to permanently be on like receiving housing and rental assistance and utility assistance. It might mean that, but it might not. But how are we moving you into a permanent place where you can stay stable for a really long time?
And it seems to me that we talk a lot in the public space around a mental health crisis.
Yeah.
Which there's a lot of things contributing to that, obviously. But it seems to me that having instability in terms of where you live cannot be helpful on that. And that just creating more stability, it's just from a logical perspective, that if you can do that, then you may diminish the worst aspects of our mental health problem.
Yeah, we get asked a lot about, is mental health the cause of homelessness, and is substance use the cause of homelessness? And the truth is, it's both a cause and a consequence.
Right.
And when you layer it in with poverty. So I know plenty of middle class and wealthy folks who have mental health challenges and who have problematic substance use issues. But because they have resources to help them through it, they don't wind up experiencing street or shelter homelessness. And so it's really those components layered in with poverty and lack of access to resources that creates the levels of homelessness that we see.
I mean, what you say certainly suggests that the causal relationship between drug abuse and homelessness is not a direct
Exactly
tie.
Right.
And for us to look at it as that is again, we're kind of missing the forest for the trees, and probably the same thing with mental health, which is a universal problem. But again, the worst thing you can do to someone who's experiencing stress from a mental health perspective is to not have a home. And even for those that are well off or comfortable, just moving your house is an incredibly stressful thing to do. Even if you have the resources to pay for it, even if you have a stable community, you're not having to move your stuff. And that is hard. There's a lot of uncertainties and a lot of paperwork and a lot of hurdles that even people that are not experiencing homelessness have to go through in order to get there.
And we don't make it easy for folks. That's one other thing that's come through the work that we've done with our communities too, is like, how can you streamline the system for people so that they can go to sort of a one-stop shop and get the assistance that they need, and we're not sending people across town. I mean, so we're headquartered in Chicago, and you might be an hour and a half on a bus going from one appointment to the next appointment. And so how can we kind of streamline the process for folks so that, again, when they are at the place where they need to reach out and ask for help, are we making that easy for them? And in most communities, we're really not making it easy for them.
You could almost argue that people that successfully manage this bureaucratic system are probably pretty impressive people in terms of how they handle it, and could be great managers, could be fantastic contributors in different ways than we realize, just because they know how to operate the system.
I mean, people who experience homelessness are people like you and me. They have incredible backgrounds and degrees and skill sets. And the first person I ever met when I started working in homelessness when I was an intern in college had his master's degree. And so, that was really like instructive for me just getting into the work, is how, when we walk by people who are experiencing street homelessness, we often don't think about what their history has been and what their life has been like. And so, of course, they have incredible skills and talents and perspectives and job histories and all of those types of things. So, but the system is really challenging to navigate, and it breaks down that trust because you're in a situation where you need help. And even if you go and ask for help, you often are not treated with dignity and respect. You are meant to go from place to place to place to tell your story over and over again to access resources. And it's just not respectful. It's not, by and large, it's not a respectful system. And so then when people who have been living on the street for a long time and have been asking for help for a long time are then the ones held accountable for not wanting to engage in housing and services, it's like, that's pouring salt into the wound, really, because again, I think the onus needs to be on service providers and government and society for saying, is the offer right? Have we treated this person with dignity and respect? Because they are humans just like us, and take our side of responsibility for that.
It seems to me that Kafka wrote quite a bit about this maybe 100 years ago. That experience that people have, and again, people that are fortunate have that experience when they go to the DMV to get themselves a new driver's license. But imagine if it's for your home, if it's for your livelihood. It's not. It's something that we need to fix, and it's hard to fix. It's hard to fix those kinds of systems. However, your Vanguard cities are having success. They are decreasing homelessness. They are finding ways to do that. What do you think are some of the more interesting, provocative, ingenious ways that they're starting to tilt the scales in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing that holds true across all our Vanguard cities is they're curious and they're trying. And they're not accepting homelessness as this inevitable issue that we'll always have with us, and we just have to manage to the best of our abilities. They believe it can be ended. They know it can be ended. They're willing to work hard on it. They are passionate, dedicated, incredible people from Mongolia to Brazil, and every which way in between. And so we are constantly inspired in our day-to-day work, being able to work and partner with these incredibly dedicated people. So that's true. So continuing to be curious, to continue to look at the evidence, to continue to try things, see if it works, iterate, is something that is true across all our Vanguard cities. That's why we call them Vanguard. They're at the forefront. They're experimenting. They're seeing what works. And so I've got a couple of examples that I can share that have been particularly compelling for our team. So one comes from Uruguay, which is our first Vanguard country. So we have a partnership with the national government, and it's a small country with a very centralized government. And they have been able to, they created a hotline that citizens can call when they see someone on the street. And it has a WhatsApp channel as well. So the citizen can literally call or WhatsApp, and that pings to a centralized team that works sort of 24/7, and they can immediately dispatch a team out to that person on the street, an outreach team of trained professionals. The dispatch team can also prioritize. So they'll find out from that caller, did it look like there was a medical emergency? Was it a mother with a child? Was it an elderly person? So they have certain things that they ask that citizen who's making that call, and can prioritize. But they send out a dispatch team. So the dispatch team gets there, talks to the person on the street, finds out what they really need, and then the dispatch team connects with their booking team, which can see all the shelters and all of the housing programs all across the city, and can see where so imagine it's a mother with a child on the street. They can look at their family shelters and see, okay, this location has a spot for that person tonight. And then the dispatch team will take them right there immediately. So it's like, and again, that comes down to the offer, right? Is the offer right? Is there a place that this person can go to immediately that fits their particular needs? And can we get them there? And they can sort of expand and contract their shelter system overnight. When my colleague and I were down there last July, they were, we gotta open up 3 small shelters tonight because last night 80 more people wanted shelter space than we had. And they're following best practice. So best practice is for smaller shelters. And so they were opening up 2 or 3 shelters with 30 spaces each. And we know that shelter itself does not end homelessness, right? But it's the beginning of that relationship between sort of engaging someone in housing and services. There's always going to be a need for some kind of first stop while you get to know that person and what they need. And so we were really impressed with what they've been able to do there in Uruguay, just the quickness of it and the precision of it and the immediate offer of emergency shelter that fits that person's need.
It seems to me as well, it makes sure that you're using your entire inventory because
Exactly.
you're centralizing the demand and you're able to make sure there isn't an empty shelter when someone is in need somewhere else.
Exactly right.
That's fantastic.
And we visited their shelters, and by and large, for the most part, it's not we think of a shelter as sort of like this big warehouse room with all of these cots, but these were shelters where there would be a room with maybe 4 beds and then a communal space where people could have food and meet with a social worker and things like that. So it was very, very dignified and very high quality. Another example comes from Glasgow, Scotland, where they've been very successful at reducing their street and shelter homelessness because they have historically had very low pressure on their housing stock. So they've had a lot of housing. The prices have been sort of what we would say are naturally occurring affordable housing, where the prices are just affordable sort of based on what people can earn. And so that's a huge part of the kind of supply and demand equation that is a part of the equation in solving homelessness is what's the supply, what's the demand, do we have supply at all these different price points? And historically for Glasgow, that's been they've been able to work that formula quite well.
Well, Glasgow certainly suggests, or your experience there suggests, or reinforces what many in the investment community believe, which is we need more housing, and we need more affordable housing.
Yeah.
That part of the pressure that's creating this steady increase of homelessness in Western cities is driven by the fact that there's just not enough housing for the population that's there, not the right kind of housing, et cetera, and not affordable. That there seems to be more and more pressure for us to figure out ways, working with the cities, working with the federal governments, to create more affordable housing that is in communities that make sense. We can't just build it out in the middle of nowhere. It has to be where people can live their lives. That is, it seems to me, if there's anything for an investor to focus on that has an impact, it would be this over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could ask you a question and flip the tables a little bit.
Certainly.
I'm curious, when you think about it from sort of a real estate investment perspective, I know there's lots of challenges to developing affordable housing here in the United States and in other parts of the world too. So kind of from your perspective, how do you feel that the investing community could dig into this issue?
The investing community has a lot of obstacles. Obviously, the rising costs are a big part of it. Whether it's the cost to construct, and there's a lot of people trying to figure out how to be more efficient and how to, we build housing the same way we've been building it for 100 years or so, and we really haven't changed a lot from a technological standpoint. So there are people that are focused on that. The land itself has become more valuable. So as housing has become more of a speculative asset class, as you've seen rising in a lot of these more successful cities, just to get your money back, if you're going to build something for all the investment you make in the land, that increases the cost of the housing to someone, unless there's some level of subsidizing that occurs. And there's a lot of efforts, a lot of great efforts that are being done by governments around the world to subsidize as a way to help augment that, but it's not enough. There still needs to be more. And then there's another area that is increasingly difficult and increasingly obvious, which is the zoning restrictions that we have on how one should build. Many of them date back maybe 100 years. And instead of having regulations that fill up maybe 10, 12 pages to say this is how to keep people safe and to do something in an appropriate way, it's now thick books of all sorts of information that sometimes is even conflicting, in great part because we haven't gone back and said, all right, what is the appropriate regulation that will keep people safe, that will make our cities livable and happy and healthy, et cetera. And how do we do it in a way that's simplified so we're not adding cost by having to, live by a set of rules that have developed kind of like lichen over time, just keep building and growing. And we need to do some assessment. I think, obviously there's people say, get rid of all regulations. There's people saying, no, we have to have them. The answer is actually in the middle. We have to have regulations that make sense, that are not adding to the cost. I think there's we talk about NIMBYism, and I think that's a pretty important thing. We have to realize that all people need to be housed, and they all need to be housed in proximity. And I think that's where a lot of people miss it. They think, I don't want to see it. It needs to be far away from me, and they push it away. I don't want it to hurt my property values. And I certainly understand that concern, and that's a big concern. But time after time, what we've discovered is that when you have a mix of incomes in a community, it actually is a more thriving community. Someone is going to have to teach in your school. Someone is going to have to, fix the roads. Someone's going to have to take all those different parts of our economy, and not all of them pay as much as a hedge fund manager. So you don't want there to just be rich people and then everyone else. You want it to be mixed. It ends up helping everybody, and the property values actually, everyone wins when you do that. So we have to change our mentality, not just from a governmental standpoint, but from a public standpoint, to understand that providing housing as infrastructure makes everyone win. You're going to make more money because you have a thriving community that doesn't have this kind of broken system that's constantly weighing us down. So those are kind of some of the bigger areas, I think, from an investor standpoint, that the obstacles that we're trying to work through. Regulatory, certainly. Costs are costs. How do you figure out a way to be more efficient? How do you figure out a way to maybe convert things that are already there? How do you figure out a way to do that in a way that is safe? And perhaps, can you streamline the regulatory process? You're not spending 2 years moving through that before you even start building. And 2 years is very expensive. You've got people working that whole time. You're not making any money back. So the investors, what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of commercial real estate is actually owned by regular people. It's not just rich fat cats or something along those lines. It's pension funds. So it's your money and this person's money and that person's money being put to work, and it has to make a return. It doesn't have to make an obscene amount of money, but that money needs to make money so that you can have a retirement, so that your savings aren't lost, et cetera, so that those things can happen. If it works right, and when it's working right, it actually, again, everyone benefits. The policeman who has a pension, but also the environment that policeman works in is healthy and happy. There's less crime. There's more success. People's houses are nice. People live in a good community. So again, we're speaking in ideals, but that's what the investor class wants. That's what the institutional investor, the investor that's acting on behalf of pension plans and sovereign wealth groups and foundations, that's what they're looking for. And they'll do everything they can to find it. But we all have to work together, I think. The communities, individual people, the public, and certainly money, all together to say, all right, how do we get this machine? And to your point, it's complicated, it's difficult, there's no silver bullet, but certainly we need to do something about it.
It's not impossible. And, as you were talking, I was just thinking about, one area of IGH's work we haven't touched is our work with the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the three underpinnings of the Sustainable Development Goals are, does this support economies? Does this support the environment? And does this support people, society? And that's why, for IGH, we just believe so strongly in these stakeholder tables to come up with these solutions, because that's who we need at the table, is people who can represent those three spheres and come up with ideas and solutions and programs and policies that serve all three of those spheres. It's definitely possible. It's definitely complicated, but we have to be able to come to the table and have those conversations. How can we make this work for everybody? And I think right now we have a system that's not working for everybody. And so we definitely welcome your perspective and the Afire community into this conversation, because we need you. We need your help to figure this out, here in the United States, but also globally.
It's you can't say it enough. This is hard. It's going to take all hands on deck, but it is possible. And we're seeing progress, and I'm inspired by what you've said just today, and the work that you and your colleagues are doing to bring us all to the same table and to get beyond the petty irritations and disagreements that we have and figure out, all right, how do we advance the ball, and how do we do a better job here? So thank you. We've pretty much run out of time. We've been speaking with Lydia Stazen, from the executive director of the Institute of Global Homelessness, based in Chicago, but focused on cities around the world and helping us all come to that table. Thank you so much, Lydia, for your work and for your ideas, and for being a part of the Afire podcast.
Likewise, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation, and hope it's not the last.
Indeed.
You have been listening to the Afire podcast. Remember to subscribe on your favorite podcast subscription service, such as Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitchers, and others. Afire is not engaged in providing tax, accounting, or legal advice. No content in this podcast is to be construed as a recommendation to buy or sell any asset. Some information included has been obtained from third-party sources considered to be reliable, though Afire is not responsible for guaranteeing the accuracy of third-party information. The opinions expressed are those of its respective contributors and sources, and do not necessarily reflect those of Afire.